cannot let these traitors to this country kill off our sovereignty, kill off everything that made this country great, everything that made this country that light on a hill, whatever you want to call it, that influenced other people to go in the direction of freedom. We've really gotten everything backwards these last couple of years. It's been quite a trial. Thank you for joining us, Deadline Live. I'm Jack Blood. I've been wanting to do this because I went back a couple of months ago and I listened to an interview that we did on this program back in 2003, just after the war started in Iraq, with Colonel Oliver North. And I'll tell you, one of the interesting things is back then we didn't have all the resources that we have now. Some of you may be feeling a little spoiled. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have social networking. There weren't even that many websites. Most of the information you got was from books or were from firsthand accounts, witnesses, eyewitnesses, that kind of a thing. And so it wasn't quite as easy to do interviews as it is now. The resources, really, if you know where to look, just at the touch of your fingertips, you can go find anything, any clip on anything. You can look at the actual hearings from the Iran-Contra trials. So I didn't have all of those resources when I did this interview, and I think we asked some interesting questions, keeping in mind that I didn't want to burn up this PR agent. I wanted to keep getting more interviews like this, so I had to be kind of careful where I stepped. But the tactic of Oliver North, which he's used for years, of just deny, is astounding in light of what we know now, what we have access to now. So we're going to try to put all of that in perspective by the time this is all over. But I have about a 30 to 40-minute interview with Oliver North where he says some very interesting things that have been completely proven wrong since he said them on this show back in 2003. Also, back in those days, we didn't have a way to really archive the shows in a simple, easy way that we have today. So I was never able to archive shows like this, and I'm going back and I'm digging through some of my old archives, the old school stuff that we did that I know a lot of you like to hear, and I'm finding some real gems. Some stuff that I probably couldn't do anymore just because of what's happened over the last couple of years. So I want to go back every once in a while and dig some of these up and play them for you. This was an interesting show because not only did I have Colonel Oliver North on for the first hour, but for the second hour, I had a survivor of Project Shad, which was an operation where the military experimented on our military men and women, using them as virtual guinea pigs, killing them, making them sick. You can find out more about that just by Googling it, S-H-A-D. I'll be playing that interview, not today, but at a later date. So we're going to be digging up a lot of these interviews, and I just think it's interesting now to go back and kind of armchair quarterback in light of everything we know to see exactly how much of the truth these people were giving us. And, of course, if I tell you you're about to hear Oliver North, you'll, I'm sure, agree, and you'll expect that you're not going to get a lot of truth. There's going to be a lot of denials, a lot of spin, and a lot of rah-rah for all the war stuff, which we know now how all of that turned out. So this, in light of all of that, I wanted to play this interview for you. It is, again, about 45 minutes in total with all the extra information we dug up. And so for the first time in total since the year 2003, 6 years ago, here is our interview with Colonel Oliver North, liar and traitor, in my own humble opinion. Here it is, folks.
And now, back to Deadline Live with your narrator, Jack Blood.
Welcome back to Deadline Live, reality radio, your anti-deception reception, your frequency for freedom, going around the world via the net and our streaming. My guest this hour needs absolutely no introduction. You all are very familiar with him. His resume is quite impressive and quite extensive. He is chairman of Freedom Alliance, host of Common Sense Radio. He's a syndicated columnist. He's a host of War Stories on the Fox News Channel. And his new book, coinciding with that and his record and his experience as an embed in the Iraqi war, is War Stories by Oliver North, Operation Iraqi Freedom. Welcome to the show, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
Jack, thank you very much. Great to be with you.
And do I call you Oli, or what do I call you? Lieutenant Colonel?
Late for dinner. I answered all of them, but whatever works, Jack.
Well, I got to thank you, first of all. I know you're a busy man, and making the time for our radio show here, heard by thousands, is important to us. So we welcome you to the show, and hopefully you won't be too hard on us.
No, I'm not. You fire away. I don't think there's anything that I've been asked that you could ask that I haven't already been asked at least once, and there's nobody shooting at me today, so it's a lot easier.
We'll see about that. Well, first off, I want to know, how did you do the deal? How did you end up going to Iraq to cover the war? Did Roger Ailes himself of Fox News personally ask you, or how did you end up going over there and getting going? Roger
doesn't ask people at Fox News. He tells them.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. He said, I want you to go over and cover this. I'd covered the Marines going into Kandahar on Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan in 2001. And there's some indications apparently in the ratings that things look pretty good when I'm over there reporting. And since that's what I do for Fox, I've got the best job in all of broadcasting. I don't have to hang around with Michael Jackson or Scott Peterson or, traipse along behind some politician waiting for him to say something memorable. All I do is hang around with heroes.
Yeah, we don't do that here either, Colonel North, so I'm glad that you're on this show because we'd like to get in the meat potatoes of things. I would guess, right off that you supported the preemptive strike against Saddam and the regime change over there in Iraq.
Well, I was over there when it happened. I mean, that 19th of March when they took that strike, I mean, I learned about it by, listening to Fox News. I had a little satellite, the transceiver that we carry with us gets a return signal back from wherever you're hooked into, and I was watching Fox News actually on air when it took place. We were broadcasting about an attempted missile strike that they'd done on the forward operating base we were living in as they prepared for the attack the next day. And we were told about it on Fox News. That's, in fact, as I relate in the book, that's how a lot of us, because you learn things, because you got a very narrow slice of the war when you're embedded with a unit. All you can see is the battlefield around you. And if you can pick something up off the radios or in one of the briefings or something, you might learn a little bit. But the best source of news we had the entire time I was over there was that little satellite transceiver.
Okay. And, the troops seem... I watched the video, and by the way, folks, with the book War Stories, I'm not sure if this... Colonel North in every copy, but I did get
it better be. Somebody's in trouble, friend.
I got a DVD in my book, and I did watch that, and a couple of things were really striking. Of course, one, that the troops were we were just talking about Martin Luther King and perception versus reality. At least the perception of this is that the troops are very encouraged to see the one and only Oliver North flying into battle as an embed, and it looked like you put your life on the line. I mean, you guys were taking fire, and you were going into some very dangerous situations.
Well, look at in this whole conflict, they had 17 reporters who were killed or died out there. I mean, David Bloom wasn't killed, but he died of complications from phlebitis. He had a thrombosis behind his leg from sitting too long in a vehicle.
I heard that David Bloom might have come to his demise from an anthrax vaccine.
No, gosh, I saw that on the internet, and that, by the way, that's one of the reasons why. It's wonderful that all this remarkable opportunity exists for people to get information over the Internet. But somebody sent me that same email. I can tell you for a fact it was a thrombosis as a consequence of simply sitting too long on those metal seats inside those vehicles. And no one had bothered to tell David. It's one of the advantages I've got over nearly all of my colleagues is I have spent my life with these guys. And if you're stuck in the back of a Humvee or in a cupola of an armored vehicle for more than a few minutes, you've got to be able to stretch your legs and get up and move around.
Yeah.
In fact, as I related in the book, after the Marines had seized Tikrit, I was sent all the way back down to Kuwait to link up with the Army and come back in with the 4th Infantry Division. And as we were driving up that road at 15 miles an hour average speed, you slow down to a mile or two, I would jump out of the Humvee and jog alongside it just to keep my body moving so you didn't have something like that happen to him.
Right. I mean, I'm not going to say you protest too much, but, I mean, obviously there was a lot of fear that, Saddam having these weapons of mass destruction would use some type of chemical weapons, especially on the front line. So
no doubt about it.
Did you yourself take an anthrax vaccine?
Of course I did. Absolutely. In fact, there's a very humorous scene in the book right there as we're getting ready to go, where all the reporters who were being embedded were brought into this big briefing. and an Army medical officer, a colonel, who's giving the briefing, is explaining to him why the advantages of the shot, and he's giving them the whole medical history of the inoculations, both for that and smallpox. And none of the reporters. He then made the terrible mistake of saying to this room full of reporters, "Are there any questions?" Well, that's like asking sheep if they want to eat, and putting them in a field of grass. And so they fired at the guy for about a half an hour about Gulf War syndrome and people dying from the thing. And he said, "Look, you don't have to take it. If you're going to take it, you have to sign this release, which is a release of liability, and you have to pay $109. These guys were all bad-mouthing it. He said, "Look, if you're not going to get it, just go on, proceed through those doors in the back of the auditorium." We were over at the Hilton Hotel in Kuwait City. And go on outside and draw your chemical weapons, protective equipment, the suit and the gas mask and the atropine injectors and all that. He said, but on the way out, you may want to just look at these pictures. And he puts up on the screen as a PowerPoint. This comes, they pop up in the screen, they fade out, and then pop up. The death throes of various people dying from anthrax and smallpox. You would not be surprised at the sudden hush that came over the room. And the very quiet, oh, my God, as people are looking at this. And then, of course, everybody went and grabbed the forms and got their shots.
Right. Well, that obviously scared them. They were afraid enough to make sure not to take any chances. Well, I mean, this isn't why you're here today, but I did want to get your take on that. But speaking about these weapons of mass destruction and the chemical weapons that most logical people would think that Saddam Hussein would have used on the Americans advancing into Baghdad, I'd like to get your take on why you think he didn't use those.
Well, yeah, very interesting. Last Friday, I'd just gotten back from California because we're doing another show about the Marines going back over. The 1st Marine Division, which came out in November, is going back here in the next few weeks. So I've been going back and forth. And I get off the plane at Dulles, and the gentleman comes up to me with a Australian accent, introduces himself as one of the Australian weapons inspectors, and he too had just gotten back, was on the same flight. We didn't see each other, but he said, "Look," he says, and I asked him about that. I said, I've been out there twice now, and nobody's found these things. He said, "I want you to try to remember what the regime was like the last 3 years, when Saddam was basically telling Uday and Qusay, his 2 sons, you take care of it." And they were responsible for some of the most brutal, heinous acts you could ever imagine. He said, I want you to imagine, just contemplate, that Saddam says to the boys, Uday and Qusay, take care of it. Get those things. The Americans are coming. Hide the stuff. You don't ship that at that point to Syria, like some people have suggested on the Internet. You dig a 150-foot long trench deep down in the desert. Remember, the quantity we're talking about here is 3 to 5 tank trucks, the likes of which haul milk up and down the interstates. That's what we're looking for. You dig that 150-foot-long trench, the truck drivers drive it down into it, and the bulldozer operator buries the truck drivers, and then they shoot the bulldozer operator. And now the only 2 people in all of Iraq who know exactly where these things are Uday and Qusay.
I'd be surprised, Colonel North. We have obviously the most sophisticated satellites to literally get the license plate off a car. You would agree with that?
Probably doesn't surprise you, Jack, that I know all about them.
It doesn't surprise me. Nothing you say actually would surprise me, Colonel North. But if that's a fact, and if we're trying to find and indicate where these weapons of mass destruction are, why wouldn't we have seen them trying to hide these?
Great point. In fact, that it tells you a lot about the limitations of satellite imagery. I was a student at the Naval War College right up there in Newport, Rhode Island, right down the road from you. When Stansfield Turner came and told our class, just before we graduated, it's in the spring of 1980, he says, just before they were leaving office, it turns out, that we now have satellites that can read license plates from 100 miles in the sky. We don't need spies anymore. They create diplomatic disasters and political problems, and let's get rid of the spies and hire the satellites. Great idea if you're going to be attacked by a license plate.
Right. Bad
idea if you're being attacked by small cells of terrorists who you can't know anything about without human intelligence.
I mean, I'm just saying. We kind of got off the subject a little bit, and again, I'm certainly not. I am no liberal and no Democrat. So Oliver North,
I'm not saying you are. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying.
I just don't want to. Hold on a second. I just don't want to come off like I'm because it's starting to feel to me that I'm attacking you on weapons of mass destruction, or you're getting defensive.
I'm not.
And all I wanted to kind of know is your take because you were there.
I think, Jack. that what you've got is a terrible failure of intelligence all along the line. I think that's why we don't know where Osama bin Laden is, if he's dead or alive, or where he is. It's why we didn't know where Saddam was in the very first days of the war, or even until the day he was captured. It tells you why we don't know where the weapons of mass destruction went. We have no doubt that he used the stuff. He had the stuff, used it, and something happened to him.
I mean, you got millions of barrels of this chemical stuff. Again,
probably not millions.
Well, this is what Colin Powell and Don Rumsfeld had indicated. A lot of it, anyway, hundreds of thousands of barrels. That's pretty hard to hide. And you're talking about big tanker trucks driven and buried in the desert. I mean, I would think that our intelligence would be able to point that out. But again, I know it's a big state and a lot of sand.
No, and unfortunately, we've got, one, far too few satellites. Number two, we've all had the James Bond movies for so long that we kind of believe it's all like that, and it's not.
Yeah, well, I don't think we even have a clue to what you know about our sophisticated, high-tech stuff. But, let's change the subject. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. When I'm looking at the DVD that comes with your book and looking at you with these soldiers, it just, again, seems to me that they were just enamored with you, Colonel North. And, in fact, one even stopped in a battle, a pitched battle from one of the palaces of Saddam Hussein, stopped, ran up to you in a helicopter, gave you a note to get more supplies and more ammunition. While doing so, recognized you, stopped in the middle of the battle, put his arm around you, and took a picture for posterity.
Took one of those little disposable Kodak cameras out of the cargo pocket of the side of his uniform, put his arm around me and held it out and snapped the picture. In fact, I have it right here in front of me. I got it, unfortunately, after the book was printed. His name is Sean Basco. He's a captain in the U.S. Marines, an F-18 pilot who on 9/11, when he saw that happen, he was assigned to a Marine fighter squadron in Japan, went in, asked for an administrative action transfer to a ground combat unit as a forward air controller, and then found himself in the lead element of the battle all the way from the Kuwaiti border right through Baghdad. And a remarkable young man who, by the way, was eventually very badly wounded in that same battle.
Yeah, you mentioned that he kept on fighting for several hours while shrapnel was in his leg.
Yeah, and was evacuated. By the way, one of the untold, great sagas of this whole remarkable experience is the casualty rate in this war, the morbidity rate, as they call it, in which wounded die, is only 1%. You stand a better chance of surviving being shot in Iraq than you do an auto accident on I-95 right outside of Providence.
Yeah, it is.
All right, folks, we'll play more of this interview. Oliver North here on this program from 2003. Stay with us, Deadline Live. Folks, Deadline Live. We're kind of live today, the 28th day of October 2009. I'm flashing back, playing an interview that we did many, many years ago, 6 years ago, with Colonel Oliver North. As I said, we didn't have the ability to access and post these interviews in the past. So, hey, why not play it on the program? That way everybody can hear it, and it's free. My gift to you. I think there's some pretty glaring stuff in here. Suffice to say, I would have done the interview a little bit differently here in 2009 than I did in 2003. I was just about a year or two into all of this at that point and trying, like so many of you, to understand what's going on. Much easier to do today. Be easy for me to play clips of Oli in his own words and really set him spinning. But he did that anyway on the program, so hopefully you'll enjoy it. Again, this is our interview with Oliver North, Colonel Oliver North, from 2003. Here it is.
You stand a better chance of surviving being shot in Iraq than you do an auto accident on I-95 right outside of Providence.
Yeah, it is amazing what our troops can accomplish, when pulling together, and I don't know why we can't all be very proud of what they're doing over there and the sacrifice they're making, depending on where you stand on principle. Whether they should be there or not, that's up to you. But obviously, these people are making the highest commitment. Again, a picture worth 1,000 words. You're interviewing one of the main players in this DVD is Lieutenant Colonel Driscoll, right?
Jerry Driscoll.
Yeah, and the guy has there was a lot of very unusual symbolism in this war. He had a Grateful Dead, the band, the Grateful Dead logo, kind of flashing up.
He's got every DVD they ever made, too, man. I'll tell you that.
And, some of the tanks were driving around there with 666 written on them, and you got this Red Dragon unit. Again, what's behind all this symbolism, and who authorizes something like 666 written on a tank?
Well, obviously every tank commander can put pretty much anything he wants in the barrel of his tank, and the logo that's on the side of those CH-46 helicopters, which incidentally are older than anybody except Jerry Driscoll in that squadron. He says it on the DVD.
Yeah.
The squadron commander does. I mean, the by the way, the Red Dragon, by the way, is Smaug from the trilogy. That's now, of course,
named after the serial killer in the book Red Dragon.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I mean, it just seems to me, I know that we have a lot of Christian listeners, and when they saw, some of this satanic symbolism as our boys are going to battle, I know it was quite disturbing for them.
Well, the message that kid was trying to send, I think, with the 666 is, if you think things were bad beforehand, I'm now here to tell you with this 120 millimeter round that you better not pick on us. These guys, by the way, the faith of these youngsters is extraordinary. As I write in the front end of the book describing the average 19-and-a-half-year-old, he may be able to take profanity to the level of a new art form.
Right.
But he's also more than likely got a Bible in his pack, and he reads from it regularly.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between being one of the boys and using profanity in a war. I mean, obviously they have that right. The thing that I think, you make the perception that you're seeing the 666, for example, again, and hey, you better watch out because I got, all this ammunition and I'm going to kill you. But I think what it also does is plays into this whole myth that, we're the infidels, we're the crusaders, we are of Satan. This whole religious, ideological battle going on between both Muslims and Christians today. I mean, I'm not sure if that's exactly the message we want to send.
Jack, let me just tell you something. I just got back here a few weeks ago, just before the holidays. Second trip over there, in this case with the 4th Infantry Division. And as a right after a bombing, in which thankfully there were no Americans killed, but it's another suicide bombing. As of this weekend, there have now been 75 of them, not one of whom has been, by the way, an Iraqi. They've all been either Saudis, Egyptians, Sudanese, Somalis, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians. No Iraqis, and interestingly enough, no Iranians. This young sergeant says to me right after one of these things, and I was running out there with my camera to document what was going on, and he says to me, this may not be a religious war for these congressmen and senators and maybe even the generals and the commander-in-chief, but I'll tell you what, for the guy who just blew himself to pieces, it was a religious war.
Well, I mean, I've seen mind-controlled people do that as well, so it begs the question. I think that's interesting, that the point that you brought up, Colonel North, that, none of the car bombings in Iraq have been done by Iraqis. I mean, that's a proven fact.
Not one. Not a single solitary Iraqi.
Why do you think that is?
Well, in part because Iraq has been always a much more cosmopolitan country than the rest of them. Number two, if Saddam ever did anything right, the one thing would have been the fact that he did not allow for 30 years any madrasas in that country. Madrasas are these Wahhabi schools where youngsters are brought in, usually at the age of 7 or 8, and for the next 7 or 8 years, all they are taught are the most virulent portions of the Sharia and the Quran. And they're taught hatred. They're taught how to kill themselves, told that everything that they do is all dependent on how they die. And so by the time a youngster's had 7 or 8 years of this, and no physics, no chemistry, no petrochemical engineering or anything like that, he doesn't know anything that will give him the skills he needs to live better. All he knows how to do is die better. And those are the youngsters who fly airplanes into buildings up in New York City and here in Washington or in a farmer's field in Somerset. You got to remember that it has little to nothing to do with wealth. It has everything to do with what they're taught.
Yeah, I mean, to be exposed to some of that ideology, generally, I mean, your poverty puts you in a position to I mean, it's just like the Christians back in the Roman days, when they didn't have a leg to stand on, that they believed that, Christ would come and wipe out the Romans or the people that didn't believe in their religion, and it really stemmed more than anything from their powerlessness, their poverty.
That's not true. I mean,
that's semantics, and we certainly don't want to waste time on a show like this for that.
Let me make sure that everybody listening to us understands. This is really important. 15 of the 19 who flew airplanes into buildings in this country on 9/11 were from the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. Okay, the other 4 were the offspring of some of the wealthiest people in their countries. Mohammed Atta, the organizer, is the son of the most successful surgeon in all of Egypt. The people who are doing this thing aren't poor people. They may take advantage of some poor people to hide among them. But in fact, Osama bin Laden himself, who asked his followers to kill himself, is one of the wealthiest people on the planet. And so wealth and poverty and oppression have very little to do with this.
Well, you cross the line at one point where power transcends money, and again, we're talking about, I guess rhetoric or semantics, but let's pass up on that. One of the things I'm curious about is General Tommy Franks, who obviously did a pretty good job leading people in there, like a lightning strike, taking over Iraq and Baghdad, to be complimented by no uncertain terms, did leave Iraq before his job was done, I guess. I mean, why do you think that he left Iraq to step down and have another general take his place to finish his job?
Because the law of the land passed by the Congress, signed by presidents ever since 1947, says that you get 35 years of service and 5 years in grade, and that's all you get. And that's exactly what he had the day he retired. Why
would they send him into a major battle like this, knowing that he was right at the end of his hitch and might have to leave? I mean, again, we went pretty fast over there, so I don't know if they expected him to go home. And he did mention he went home to his family, and obviously can be accredited for that. But it seems like he left the job undone, don't you think?
Well, but I mean, the same thing happens in every war, because the law of the land is that that's all the years you can serve. You're not allowed to serve a minute beyond it. And so Franks was assigned to that command 3 years before, when nobody expected that he'd be at war. And I think he did, you're talking to a Marine,
yeah.
And I'm telling you that soldier who put that together did a remarkable job. I mean, it was no military force in history has ever gone so far, so fast, with so few casualties to either side as Franks did in that war. I mean, it was a remarkable victory. Primarily because 19-year-olds did extraordinary things.
Tommy Franks,
magnificent.
General Franks, I guess in an article that he'd been interviewed by a magazine, I guess he didn't think a lot of people would see, called Cigar Aficionado, where he had warned that if the United States or even Western Europe gets hit by a major terrorist attack, that we would have to tear up the Constitution and go to instant martial law and turn this into a military state. What do you think he meant by that?
I've got the article right here, and what he says is, I'm concerned that if, as a consequence, we have a major terrorist attack. This is before 9/11, he said it, and he's recalling it in this article. He said, I am concerned that we might be tempted to tear up the Constitution. And I think that there's people with justifiable concerns about the Patriot Act.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, I don't think we ought to have to sacrifice the Bill of Rights to protect ourselves from the likes of Osama bin Laden. And I think that many of the steps that were taken in the midst of this war, and we are in a war, need to be looked at again when this war is won, because we don't want to live for 100 years under a lot of the provisions of the Patriot Act. I don't think we should have to. I don't think people, quite frankly, I'm tired of giving up my nail clippers when I get on an airplane.
Right. I mean, they even search Colonel Oliver North.
I go through the same metal detector you do, buddy, and I wrote the SOP.
Yeah, I saw actually when I was down in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, I saw a soldier who was in civilian clothes, and once he'd gone through the X-ray machine and they found out that he was a military guy on leave, they descended on him pretty quick and started asking him a lot of questions. Where are you going? How long are you on leave? It seemed to me like there was some kind of a net there to prevent soldiers from going AWOL, I guess. I don't know, but I felt kind of bad for the guy. I think we agree on a lot of things. I don't know where you stand on the United Nations. I'm certainly no friend of handing over things to the unilateralists and the globalists. And if I can compliment the Bush administration on one thing, it's taking them down a notch. When you mention old Europe in your book, and when Rumsfeld mentions old Europe, I mean, I hear globalist and attached to the Eastern establishment here, which I believe, could be the shadow government that George W. Bush is talking about.
Well, I found it to be fascinating that everybody now wants, Bremer to, and he did. He went up today and tried to sit down with Kofi Annan, who claims that he wants to get back in there. But I point this out: we've now suffered the loss of 500 Americans in fighting for the opportunity to give the people of Iraq the freedom that we enjoy. And the United Nations suffered one attack, by the way, driven by a Saudi, in which they lost 19 people, and they immediately pulled out. Who's going to lead the UN back in there? France? I mean, I think it's astounding that people think the United Nations is...
I mean, these France, even Britain these days, and Germany, certainly these are socialist regimes, not unlike a Saddam Hussein's regime. I mean, we got to look at, exactly what happened here, and I don't have you for much longer, but, I mean, I think we all have to admit that a guy like Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq war, was blowback from the days of Mossadegh when the region became unstable. I mean, obviously, Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset. He worked for us and worked with us and helped the Reagan and Bush administration for many years. Maybe we learned a lesson. What do you think, Colonel North?
Well, let me come back to something you just said about the British. The first 12 casualties of the war happened about 30 feet from me, and 8 of them were Royal Marines, and there's still 25,000 British troops over there, among them the Royal Marine Commander.
I'm talking about the socialist government of Britain and not the soldiers, certainly.
At the same time, Tony Blair, notwithstanding the fact that he's a Labourite, has been remarkably courageous politically for standing up to it. Now, where this whole thing ends up with the UN and these others stepping into it, I don't have the gift of prophecy, but I would submit to you that the best chance the people of Iraq have is for the United States to keep what will probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 100,000 troops out there by the beginning of the spring, and keep them there long enough to train enough Iraqis to protect themselves and turn over that government on the 1st of July, as Bremer said today that he wants to, and give them the chance to bring about a real democracy that's a model for the rest of that part of the world. I think that's where we're headed out there.
Well, I like to think positive, though. I've seen how these things work, and again, I'm going to think positive with you, Ollie. War Stories is the book, Operation Iraqi Freedom. You can get that anywhere. It includes a DVD with some amazing footage you must have gotten right from the Department of Defense, because I haven't seen it anywhere. In fact, there's a little caption on some of this footage from Fox and Friends.
My cameraman. Most of that was shot by me and my cameraman, or the other 2 combat camera teams that Fox had out there.
Now, is it true that you and Jesse Helms formed the American Eagle Foundation, a 501c3?
No.
It's not. Why are people reporting that? This is now the Eagle Forum headed by Lynn Cheney.
No, neither one. I founded a Freedom Alliance, which is an educational charitable foundation, gives scholarships to youngsters who have lost a parent serving in the line of duty in the armed forces. People want to buy a book that'll support that. It's already autographed. They go to the website, olivernorth.com. All my books are there. And all of those books and the proceeds from it support that scholarship fund. That's what I do.
All right. Well, Eagle Foundation did buy 75% of Regnery, which your book is published on. And it's no secret. I had Buzz, what's his name? He carried the nuclear football, one of your co-authors there on Regnery.
It's Buzz Patterson. That's an interesting interview we'll have to play for you going forward. Thanks for joining us today, folks. Deadline Live, AmericanFreedomRadio.com. We'll come back. We'll continue more with Oliver North right after this. A little clip there from American Dad. Fox News, by the way. Can you believe they aired that? Why did they do that, Jack? Well, all of the information we have now, the testimony about Oliver North and Poindexter and George Herbert Walker Bush smuggling cocaine for healthy Americans everywhere in order to give our now enemy Iran weapons of mass destruction. If you see it on a cartoon, it just can't be true. I mean, what are you going to go out and tell people, hey, I saw that on American Dad, it must be true. Or I read it somewhere, I read it in a book, I saw the testimony, and I listened to the great DEA whistleblower, Sela Castile, or Mike Levine on Deadline Live talking all about this, giving their first-hand accounts on the dope smuggling with the CIA in order to give Iran weapons of mass destruction. Oh, that can't be true, because I saw that on American Dad, on Fox News of all places. I tend to think that Ollie wasn't very happy about that. By the way, I'm playing the interview that we did back in, I think it was either just the turn of the calendar of 2004 or the end of 2003. I don't have the record, but it was right in that era when we had invaded Iraq, and everybody was very starry-eyed and very optimistic, and the propaganda was holding. As I reported yesterday, the news came out here recently thanks to an in-depth investigative report by Raw Story that the embed reporters were being completely dominated and controlled by the Pentagon, and all news as we knew it, and the war back then was being controlled. So all we really had was the internet and whistleblowers' accounts, and at the time they didn't add up anywhere near what we have today. asking Colonel Oliver North about 9/11 or something wasn't as easy as it might be today, because we just didn't have all the information that we have thanks to all of the great researchers. There were no David Ray Griffins. At the time, there was just one or two or three people really digging deep into 9/11, so we didn't even know then what we know now. Hard to believe, isn't it, 2003, but that's how slow the information was moving at the time. It's really tempting for me to break into this interview and correct the record, but we're going to do that at the end of the interview. But there's so many things there, like the incompetence theories. Well, we just had terrible intelligence. That's how we lost those weapons of mass destruction, which have never been found to this day. Almost everything said about weapons of mass destruction was a complete lie. As we know, Saddam had let that part of his arsenal deteriorate, and most of it was a bluff. It was a poker bluff on his neighbors, who, the second they knew he was disarmed, would descend upon him. Not something that Colonel Oliver North wants to admit. And did you hear him kind of skirt the question, not answer the question? And I could have done a better job asking it again, by the way. Again, you learn a lot doing this through the years, but I did ask him, Saddam Hussein worked for us. We used him and played both sides in the Iran-Iraq war. And he went on to talk about how great the troops are, which is something he did. You hear him talk about Tommy Franks. He's got that Cigar Aficionado article in front of him, which I'm almost 99.9% sure came out after 9/11. Let's just call it 100% sure. So he tried to say that it came out before and it was nothing, and no, we don't want to take our liberties away, and I, Oliver North, have to go, take my shoes off going through the airport turnstiles, which I really seriously doubt to this day. His talk about satellite surveillance. Oh, well, we can read license plates, but we're not fighting license plates. We're fighting guys in sheets on camels. Complete bunk, complete BS. We had an eye on them the entire time. If there were any weapons of mass destruction, we would have found them. I think it was just before then or just after then that I got to speak to Scott Ritter and got the real lowdown. I think that was before, on where the weapons of mass destruction were. But a lot of the questions you're going to ask a guy like Colonel Oliver North are futile. He's not going to answer them. Well, I continue to do that. We'll play what is about the second half of this interview in the next hour, coming up here after the top of the hour break. You're listening to Deadline Live. I'm Jack Blood, live today, the 28th of October, AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Stay with us. Well, if you've just joined us, we are flashing back on an interview about 6 years ago with Colonel Oliver North here on this program. Suffice to say, he didn't want to come back. In fact, he called the publisher and said I accused him of being a liar for an hour. This is a pretty interesting segment because I start talking about the FEMA camps that we had pictures of. Things have changed drastically since then. Now they're re-education camps built by Halliburton, and as we know from Katrina, and they'll just use a Superdome for that. They've managed to kind of co-opt Walmarts and Superdomes and everything else to hold Americans in. So times have certainly changed. But I think we asked the appropriate questions, considering that Oliver North was one of the authors of the Civilian Inmate Labor Program. That he was actually questioned during Iran-Contra on the continuance or continuity of government, which is something, of course, the Bush administration capitalized on after 9/11, and Rex 84 directly. These are things that he knew about but wouldn't admit to on the program. What does he do? You'll listen. You'll hear it with me in this next segment. By the way, we're talking about Buzz Patterson, who also did this show, carried the nuclear football for Clinton for a year or two, and we started talking about the shadow government in that interview, and it got very weird. I will play that maybe next month or going forward, or we'll upload it to the website. But for your enjoyment, here is Oliver North being grilled by yours truly. Kind of our own little Iran-Contra panel back about 6 years ago. Here it is.
Yeah, it's no secret. I had Buzz, what's his name? He carried the nuclear football, one of your co-authors there on Regnery. And
yeah, by the way, Tom Phillips, who's the owner of Regnery, yeah, would be interested to know that somebody else owns 75% of his company. So
well,
he's the guy that
this is on the record, so I don't want to debate some of these issues, but I was setting this up because there's a lot of things that tied to the Oliver North name with the word Eagle in it. There's been a recent debate about this Eagle Aviation Service and Technology called East, I guess. You're familiar with them?
No. This may come as a big surprise to you. I spend most of my life literally hanging around with those heroes. I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, this would have been back in the days when the Iran-Contra thing was going on, and they were actually doing some of the work in Colombia. There's a big scandal now that they're down there fighting. This is a subcon. What do you think? Let me segue into a question real quick. What do you think about companies like DynCorp that have soldiers of fortune, who have actually raped and murdered kids and refugees? I mean, what do you think about soldiers of fortune working for private multinational companies?
Well, I'm first of all, multinational companies and soldiers of fortune, I'm not familiar with them. I mean, I've seen what the contractors like USA Environmental are doing out there, and that's documented in this book. And they're trying to destroy 300 million tons of ordnance that Saddam Hussein left behind in just one of over 100 depots. By the way, you mentioned rapes. It's interesting to note that because I'm the documentarian for Fox, I went back and checked. A week after D-Day at Normandy, June 6, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower court-martialed a dozen members of what was then, I think, arguably the finest infantry division, the 101st Airborne, for rape and looting. We've now been at war over there in Afghanistan since October of 01, since March of 03 in Iraq. How many charges of rape and looting have there been?
Well, I don't know if those are all going to get out. Let's be realistic, Colonel North. I mean, not every soldier and every Marine is a good guy that's just going to do the right thing,
Jack,
mom apple pie.
There have been 0 charges of rape and looting in either country, and if
there's no police. This is tribal law. There's no police force there, and it's pretty easy to cover that kind of thing up.
Jack, that's just not true.
This stuff always comes out, 10 years later. Well, I got you here. Let me ask you about a document, concentration camps in America, U.S. Army Civilian Inmate Labor Program. Are you familiar with that at all?
No.
Well, there's plenty of documentation, including right from Ashcroft's own mouth in the Village Voice and among other articles, that there are concentration camps run by FEMA all over America. Yes.
Where's the nearest one to Providence?
I can't prove it to you on the radio in 1 minute, but I'd be happy to do so.
Jack, if that stuff is true, let's get the photo. You tell me where they are, and I'll take a Fox News crew out there, and we'll photograph them.
I have you on the record. Is that a promise?
You got it.
It'd be pretty easy to do. Okay. All right. Well, we'll drop that then, and we'll take you up on your offer, Colonel North. Can I get a hold of you through the usual methods?
The usual methods.
That'll be a big story for you.
Well, it would be a big story for anybody. That's why I'm surprised we haven't seen the photograph.
Well, we want to expose that here, and I'm a little afraid with all this talk about martial law and Code Red and concentration camps. And it is a very scary world we live in now, and a lot of my listeners are very concerned, that the CIA and certain people don't have their best interests. The globalists don't have their best interests at heart.
Well, I would feel much better if we had a CIA that could collect human intelligence on terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, and some of these other groups that are out there like Osama bin Laden.
You mean instead of funding them into existence and having double agents infiltrating Hamas and all of these many organizations?
And it's not fair to your audience not to put the truth out. Osama bin Laden never got 1 single cent of CIA money, not a penny. Didn't need it. For one thing, wouldn't have taken it for another.
Yeah, I think he got it right from his family, which got it in selling weapons and many other things. That's another story. How's Ted Shackley, one of your old cohorts? How's he doing? Is he still living in Colombia?
I have no idea. I've never met the man. I'm not sure what you've been reading, Jack, but Ted Shackley, if I remember correctly, it was gone well before I ever showed up on the scene.
Well, I thank you for being on the program today. Look,
you send me the locations by lat long, as we call it, on a GPS of where those sites are, these concentration camps. I will photograph them for you, and you can break the story.
I think they've actually already been photographed, which is why I was asking you about them. But you know what? I would like to take you up on that, because with your name behind it, maybe we'll expose some of this, Oli. And, I got to tell you, thank you very much for putting up with me for the last half hour. I don't kiss the butts of my guests. I know you never did, so you being an example for me, I had to ask you a few tough questions, clear up a few things if I could. War Stories, Operation Iraqi Freedom by Oliver North. Make sure you get the one with the DVD, some very awesome footage in that. And again, Oliver North, one last thing. I have a gentleman on coming up in just a few minutes. He was involved or was the victim of something called Project Shad. Do you have any information on that before I let you go?
I can't help you with it.
Never heard of it?
No.
Okay. Hey, thanks for joining us, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Deadline Live. Thanks for joining us today, Colonel.
You're welcome, Jack.
Awesome. All right. There you have it, folks. Everything that we know is wrong. The congressional records are wrong. The pictures of the FEMA camps don't exist, and he never heard of all of the people that he was tied into Iran-Contra. He was never actually in Iran-Contra, never testified in front of the Senate committee hearings on Iran-Contra, wasn't convicted, and then again let go on that charge, never getting into the actual charges of money laundering, drug smuggling, and many of the other covert activities that he was involved for his country. Now, if he would have actually worked with me a little bit and said, Jack, we have to be grown men. There was a fierce communist threat back in the 70s, and I was just serving my country. I was doing my job, and I can debate with you all day on why I know better than you, why we need to do these things. But we didn't get to that point. That's a pretty clever tactic. Just deny, deny, deny. So I'm not Jack Blood. You're not listening to Deadline Live. And we'll be up here shortly with J.B. Brown, somebody not suffering from Project Shad. You're listening to Deadline Live. Stay tuned. We'll be back with more.
Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! I need someone. Help! When I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way. Now.
So let's talk about the CIA clearing themselves, and to an expert, it's so far beyond funny. Again, thank God I have these microphones, or else I just can't go right to a psychiatrist with this. I am looking right in front of me. You can hear the crinkling of the paper at a reproduction dated 9 July 84 of Oliver North's diary. Now, I got this from the National Security Archives. Anyone listening can get it. And what it says here is, toward the bottom of the page, it says, call from Claridge. Now, who is Claridge? Claridge is Dwayne Dewey Claridge, CIA officer who was placed in charge of the Contra support mission. That was the CIA officer. Now, before we go any further on this page, let's flash to a show I did on Fox News Channel with Mr. Claridge. And Mr. Claridge on this show said flat out, Oli North was nothing. This was the CIA. We're talking about the Contras. Oli North was nothing. He was insignificant. Basically, what he was saying is this is a CIA operation. So now, with that in mind, listen to what this page says. Call from Claridge. This is Oliver North writing. Now, they discussed the following. They discussed a call from Calero. Now, who's Calero? He's the Contra leader, Adolfo Calero. So here you have Oli North, who is an insignificant nothing, according to Mr. Claridge, and him talking about a phone call from Calero. Now, one of them got the phone call. I'm not sure if it was Claridge or Oli North, but one of them got this phone call. Now, under this, it says, number one, wanted aircraft to go Bolivia, pick up paste. Wanted aircraft. Number two, want aircraft to go pick up 1,500 kilos. Well, when I waved this in front of Mr. Claridge, he said kilos could be anything. He said basically on national television, kilos could be anything. It could be shoes. It could be shoes from Bolivia. Come on. I mean, I've heard that before. I have to tell you, in the thousands of cases I've had, I've heard that cop-out before, but you're not supposed to say it on national television. You're supposed to say that to a jury of Americans who then convict you. But now, Mr. Claridge, said it on the Cryer report, but what can you do to Mr. Claridge? George Bush has already pardoned him. I mean, in case you guys didn't know, the President of the United States pardoned Claridge for perjury, lying to Congress before we could even try him. So here's Mr. Claridge now, honorably retired from the CIA with this evidence that is damning evidence of conspiracy,
Reagan was elected to the presidency. He installed Louis Giuffrida as head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Giuffrida was an old, cold warrior from Reagan's California days whose specialty was suppression of unrest and dissent. Giuffrida, North, and George Bush began to turn FEMA into an instrument of domestic anti-terrorism.
You're dealing with a group of people in the Reagan administration who equated political dissent with treason, and who cannot differentiate between emergency procedures, which I think everyone agrees are necessary, and suppressing political dissent. And with North and Poindexter and Casey, you had a group of people who saw Americans who disagree with them as the enemy.
Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was.
May I most respectfully request that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
And tragically, the only member who got close was Jack Brooks, and he was stopped by the chairman.
This lieutenant colonel is not going to challenge a decision of the commander-in-chief for whom I still work, and I am proud to work for that commander-in-chief. And if the commander-in-chief tells this lieutenant colonel to go stand in the corner and sit on his head, I will do so.
That notion troubled Senator Inouye, a combat hero of World War II. He reminded Colonel North of the military code of a soldier's duty.
The Uniform Code makes it abundantly clear that it must be the lawful orders of a superior officer. In fact, it says members of the military have an obligation to disobey unlawful orders. This principle was considered so important that we, the government of the United States, proposed that it be internationally applied in the Nuremberg trials. And so in the Nuremberg trials, we said that the fact that the defendant...
May I please register an objection? I find this offensive. I find you're engaging in a personal attack on Colonel North, and you're far removed from the issues in this case.
Colonel North's lawyer deflected Senator Inouye, but some of North's fellow officers watching on television took issue with the colonel.
I'm 2 years senior to Oliver North out of the Naval Academy, and the only thing he's got on me is a Silver Star and 6 more years in the Corps. And when Oliver North started to say the things he started to say, I literally wanted to throw things at my TV set. I seriously considering mailing my Naval Academy ring back to the Naval Academy and denying ever having gone there. I was so embarrassed and humiliated that a professional military officer would stoop to the dishonor and disgrace and warmongering that Oliver North and Poindexter and McFarland and the rest of the crew did. Selling arms to the Iranians after they blew up the Beirut barracks, after they blew up the Beirut embassy, is the most immoral thing. That's like selling Zyklon B to the Germans after you found out the Holocaust is underway.
One of my drill instructors in the Marine Corps, by the way, we were talking about, at that time, there were a lot of protests in Washington, D.C., and somebody said, well, those commie lovers or whatever. And the drill instructor told us something as we were about to graduate. He said, what you're fighting for might be wrong or right. Nobody really knows. But he said there's a constitution that allows those people to be out on the streets protesting. He said that's what's worth fighting for. That's what the Constitution is. He said that's what you took an oath to. And when you put those bars on as a second lieutenant, you better remember that. I don't think Oliver North had that drill instructor.
It was career military men who managed the Iran-Contra debacle under Reagan and Casey. North, Poindexter, McFarland, Secord, Singlaub were all trained to fight wars, not run foreign policy. In war, the aim is absolute and simple: destroy the enemy, no matter what. They had little understanding of politics in Iran, Nicaragua, and most important, in Washington. Our foreign policy has increasingly become a military policy. Ronald Reagan has doubled the number of military men on the staff of the National Security Council. What was created in 1947 as a civilian advisory group to the president has become a command post for covert operations run by the military. Far removed from public view and congressional oversight, they are accountable only to the one man they serve. The framers of the Constitution feared a permanent state of war, with the commander-in-chief served by an elite private corps who put the claims of the sovereign above the Constitution.
This is the first page of an order signed and approved.
All right, we're playing you some background information to go with that interview you heard today on the program. We'll play more of that when we come back and lay out some of the facts that we know now here in 2009. Stay with us. Deadline Live, AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Doing a bit of an expose today, going back on Iran-Contra, going back to Operation Phoenix. I had asked Oliver North in that interview about his buddy Ted Shackley, who was involved in Operation Phoenix, that is the psychological warfare and terror that was used against the North Vietnamese people in Vietnam. I've never heard of him. I don't know him. I don't know him at all. He was also involved, according to every expert, including Richard Secord, involved in the whole Iran-Contra thing. That's why I asked him. I mean, this is another war criminal running around, and it's very difficult to conduct an interview with somebody who just denies and gives you the puppy dog eyes. But I often wonder, going back, what if Bush, Oliver North, Colin Powell, Mr. Poindexter, Mr. Negroponte, Bill Casey, McFarland, and all these guys back from that era, what if they were made to face their crimes and to be punished for them? How different would the world be today? Wouldn't have had George Bush fulfill his presidency. He couldn't have passed the torch on to his Illuminati brother, Bill Rockefeller Clinton, that's then passing the torch along to baby Bush. And we wouldn't even be where we're at now with Barry Obama. How much of history would be changed? How much of the world would look different today if all of these traitors who would do anything for their commander-in-chief, allegedly, who would bury the Constitution and wipe their asses with it, if they were called to the carpet, called to account for their crimes, and that served as an example for others who might follow in their footsteps, what would the world look like now? Going back to this clip that we're playing about continuity of government and about, just following orders, as you heard Colonel Oliver North said, if I was told to go sit in the corner and stand on my head, I'd do it. Wouldn't matter if it was constitutional or not, according to him. Because there's something much greater. National security is much greater than the Constitution, at least in the eyes of these subservient jekylls. And that's what they are. Where are all these men today? They've been promoted, and they have storied careers, historic careers, and they're making money hand over fist. What would things be like if they were called to account for their crimes? Let me just play a little bit more of this, and we'll talk more on the subject.
With the commander-in-chief served by an elite private corps who put the claims of the sovereign above the Constitution.
This is the first page of an order signed and approved by President Reagan.
This is the ultimate weapon of the secret government, the National Security Decision Directive, the NSDD. Every president since Harry Truman has issued them. They're not published in any government register. Ronald Reagan has signed at least 280 such directives. They cover everything from outer space to nuclear weapons to covert operations in Iran and Nicaragua. In essence, by an arbitrary and secret decree, the president can issue himself a license to do as he will, where he will. And the only ones who need to know are the secret agents who carry it out, the Knights of the Oval Office.
That agency. You have testified that as a member of the National Security Council staff, you conducted a covert operation. And my question is, did the President specifically designate the National Security Council staff for that purpose?
I think what I have said consistently is that I believe the President has the authority to do what he wants with his own staff, that I was a member of his staff, that Mr. McFarland was, and that Admiral Poindexter was, and that in pursuing the President's foreign policy goals of support for the Nicaraguan resistance, he was fully within his rights to send us off to talk to foreign heads of state, to seek the assistance of those foreign heads of state to use other than U.S. government monies, and to do so without a finding.
So a lot of that actually aired on the Bill Moyers program back in the 80s. Didn't do anything about it. Going back to Mr. Shackley, who you can read quite a bit about on the Internet these days, after his appointment to the head of the CIA in 1976, Father Poppy Bush ran a global drug-running operation from his office in Langley, Virginia. According to many eyewitnesses, many who have been on this program, you just heard Mike Levine in a testimony earlier on this program, looking directly at Oliver North's notes. Oh, we're going to pick up some paste and some kilos. But that's not cocaine, right? Okay. Don't forget that our buddy John Skull and Bones Kerry was looking into this, right? Among some of the chosen operatives back in that time was Theodore Shackley, whom Bush named as the CIA's Associate Deputy Director for Covert Operations. Shackley had been the head of the CIA station in Miami during the 1960s, where E. Howard Hunt and his fellow Watergate burglars would emerge. Shackley went on to head the CIA station in Saigon during the Vietnam War, where he masterminded Operation Phoenix, again, something that Oliver North was a part of. This involved the death of tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians who were, quote-unquote, suspected of working for the Viet Cong. Oliver North, the star of the Iran-Contra arms for drug scandal during the Reagan-Bush administration, worked with Shackley on Operation Phoenix. Of course, he denied that, which is reputed to have murdered 40,000 Vietnamese villagers. Important to note because, as I've been mentioning on this show, Operation Phoenix has come home. Shackley ran a huge assassination and drug operation in Southeast Asia in the 1970s, in which two other Bushmen, Donald Gregg and Felix Rodriguez, were involved. So was Richard Armitage, that is the mentor for Colin Powell, Deputy Secretary of State to Colin Powell at the time. He actually acted as his underling in the time of 9/11 when he was really, in fact, running the State House. Powell described Armitage in his book, My American Journey, as my brother, my bodyguard. The drug operation in Southeast Asia was threatened when President Kennedy sought to withdraw from Vietnam, the Illuminati war that had cost lives of 50,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese. After Kennedy's assassination, the war was expanded, along with the drug trafficking. Bush appointed the same Theodore Shackley to an important position in the CIA in 1976, and Shackley would later be recruited as Bush's speechwriter during the 1979-80 election campaign. The idea that someone like Shackley would be hired to write Bush's speeches defies the imagination, and no doubt his other talents were the real reason for his presence. Shackley later lived in Medellin, Colombia, home of the drug cartel that interlocks with the CIA operation. Thomas Kleins, a former second-in-command at the CIA station in Miami, was another Bush appointee at the CIA who would be involved in Iran-Contra, a scandal Bush was to say he knew nothing about. He was out of the loop. The buck didn't stop there. During the Bush tenure at the CIA, the operatives knew they could do virtually as they like because their director had a gift for looking the other way. The power over U.S. intelligence operations was concentrated in Bush's hands as a result of a series of measures introduced by President Ford, a frontman for the mob. And his vice president, you got him, Nelson Rockefeller. Both were installed without an election by the Kissinger-manipulated Watergate affair that forced Richard Nixon to resign. In the words of the New York Times, Ford centralized more power in the hands of the director of the Central Intelligence than any had since the creation of the CIA. Among Bush's CIA operatives in South America was the Nazi Busher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, allegedly, who had escaped from Europe thanks to the British and U.S. intelligence and the networks of the Church of Rome. It was Barbie who masterminded the cocaine coup in Bolivia in 1980, used the profits from the CIA-supported drug networks to finance the neo-Nazi overthrow of the government of Argentina, which led to about 25 years of problems. According to the former U.S. drug enforcement agent who you heard earlier, Mike Levine, this coup was achieved by troops wearing Nazi armbands. Another globalist front operation closely connected to Father Bush is Sun Myung Moon's Mooney Church, which was founded into existence by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, Bo Hai-pak, Moon's right-hand man, was among the first to arrive in La Paz after the Barbie Bush cocaine coup in Bolivia. Moon, it is claimed, invested $4 million in the coup and was to help finance Bush's run for the presidency in 1998. The Washington Times newspaper, so supportive of the Bush crime family, is owned by Moon. And the Secretary General of the United Nations is South Korean Ban Ki-moon, who has been linked to the Moonies by some researchers. That is very difficult information to find. We have been looking for that for years. If you come up with anything substantial, please let us know. Is Ban Ki-moon, who's now the Secretary General of the United Nations, is he directly connected to Reverend Sun Myung Moon and therefore the Bush crime family and the other operatives of the Illuminati? That's a pretty good question. That's pretty important to understand, even as Ban Ki-moon is running around shilling for climate change legislation, as they call it now. It used to be called global warming legislation. Something happened there on the way to the moon. That would be important to know. I mean, this is definitely a South Korean. He has the same name, but they claim there was absolutely no connections. Going back to Bush and Reagan, the contacts that Poppy Bush made at the CIA would be invaluable when he became vice president to Ronald Reagan. Many believe it, as I do, that after the assassination, literally weeks after the inauguration of Ronald Wilson Reagan, the Bush man in the White House, which was literally a bloodless coup on this country, took complete control of that White House. A lot of people I know revere Reagan. He didn't have much time to really do anything. He was another teleprompter reader. I'm sorry to shock you, but that's what we know to be the truth. Reagan's personal fortune dated, also a Bohemian Grover, had dated back a time shortly after becoming governor of California when he bought some land cheaply, sold it at enormous profit to a group of benefactors who have never been publicly identified. Reagan, the former B-movie actor, longtime member of Bohemian Grove, initiate of the Knights of Malta. He was 70, the oldest man to be inaugurated as president. Maybe this has fallen down the memory hole. His mind failing. He needed long afternoon naps each day, and almost everything he said, even in the relatively off-the-cuff situations when greeting foreign leaders, was written for him on cue cards by his aides. Father George Bush was president in all but name. And just to kind of throw this in, Reagan's mind further deteriorated after the assassination attempt in 1991 by John Hinckley, who had connections to the Bush family. Just a big coincidence. This gave Bush almost complete control of affairs in the background and the power that was behind the throne. His mentor, and that is, of course, the mentor of Bill Clinton, of Baby Bush, and of your own cousin Barry Obama, Henry Kissinger, who had been controlling events even since he officially left public office. Still does today. CIA scientist with the patch on his chest. Have you heard of this guy? He came out, he was a whistleblower, came out and said he had a patch on his chest. And then he was talking about how he was summoned to the White House during the Father Bush presidency, and he walked into the Oval Office, and there was Kissinger, even though he had officially no role in the administration, much like he did with Baby Bush and what he does now with Obama. This scientist, this patch he had, by the way, was allegedly an assassination patch. They sew that into you, and if you say something they don't like, it's a kill switch, much like we were talking about with the microchip situation the other day with our microchip expert. This scientist said that Kissinger sat in the president's chair. He ran the whole meeting while Bush just nodded. Of course, as we know, this happens with virtually all major governments. The men who seem to have the power are controlled by quote-unquote advisors, manipulators, the public never hears about. These are scapegoats generally. If there's any major problem, hey, put a blue dress on it. Break out the cigars. Boy Bush, Tony Blair, perfect examples of that during the last 8 years. In fact, I heard a story once which was reported in the mainstream media. The former, I guess it was a Presidente of Spain, he's now since been gone and replaced by a socialist regime. First day in office, gets a visit by Henry Kissinger. Didn't call for him. Nobody had notified him, but Henry Kissinger's here. He needs to talk to you. And Kissinger, the leader of Spain, begins to tell him exactly what they're going to do and what the plan is and what will happen to him if he doesn't follow the plan. Well, of course, a lot of that didn't leak out, but I think we can read between the lines. So, I mean, all of this is important to understand, and why I'm flashing back a little bit today, because if we do not learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. I think it's really important to understand that these players, all these players, are still the men behind the scenes, the men behind the curtain today. I mean, why can't Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski or these guys just retire, or Brent Scowcroft? These guys are all in their 70s and their 80s, some of them. How can they still be guiding, allegedly, foreign policy today? How can they still be in the ear of the president? How can they still be operating a group of front men that control the puppet strings of the alleged President Cousin Barry Obama? So for you younger people out there, I hope today was a good flashback so you understand kind of how we got here, how nothing has changed at all, how all the same people are making the decisions, and how we need to get rid of these people ASAP if we want things to change for real. Stay with us. I hope you enjoyed this flashback on our program today and the added commentary. I've been wanting to do that for a long time. If you like that, let us know. Write us at jackblood@hotmail.com. I got a lot of stuff like that I want to put out on the radio. Some of the best work we did early. Not to say we still don't do good work, but it's harder to get interviews now for some reason. It might be the last 8 years of grilling we've done by people like Oliver North. But if you want to hear more stuff like that, if you enjoy that, just send me a note and let me know, and I'll try to get more of it on. We've got some just amazing stuff we've done over the years, and a lot of it just fell through the cracks. It didn't get posted. It's not online. It's not accessible to anyone. So if I play it on the show, give you that freebie, then it'll be online and people can find it, and we'll make use of it, hopefully. A lot to say about all of that. I'm going to kind of just let it stand where it is. Just a couple of quick